All right, Heroes to High students. So today's lecture is on late summer management to get ready for winter. So one of the big things that we're all trying to do as beekeepers is make sure that we're getting our bees to survive through winter. And really, August is kind of the time of the year that you should be really starting to think about this, and to ensure that you are able to get your colonies large enough and have enough resources on, and get their health in check, to make sure you're able to make it through winter. So let's take a look at how we do this. All right, so what's happening this time in late summer? Well, day length is reducing. So after the summer solstice, the days start to get shorter. So day length is getting shorter over the course of the season. Temperatures, as far as mean temperatures, are generally starting to fall as we go into August and September. And so we are starting to see temperature decreases as well. In addition to all of this, resources in the landscape are starting to get more and more scarce. So most of us in July get a pretty big honey flow in northern climates, and then as we get into August, that starts to wane. We sometimes have summer dearths, depending on where you're at and what resources you have. A lot of times those can occur generally kind of the end of August or end of July, beginning of August. We also have situations where we do sometimes get a late summer flow of honey coming in northern climates. Oftentimes that's correlated with the goldenrod bloom. However, late season flows don't always come to fruition, and the reason is because sometimes it gets pretty dry in that time of the year, and if we don't get enough rainfall during that honey flow, those goldenrod plants may produce nothing. So those late summer resources like goldenrod and others may not actually produce a measurable or a consistent or large amount of nectar during that period, depending on what the weather is like. So resources are becoming more and more scarce. And as we just move into the winter, there's just less and less floral resources available. In addition, during this time of the year, bees are starting to shift priorities and attitudes. So as far as honey goes, really honey being stored is a big priority for the colony. And during this time, storing as much honey as they can to get through winter is a huge priority. In addition, so when we start getting into the later part of the season, we start to see the temperament of bees change a little bit. And so you can start to see robbing behaviors as we start to move into August and into September. And those behaviors are something that really is an indication of just how valuable the honey resource is. So by robbing, what we generally mean is that we have weaker colonies that are unable to defend themselves against larger colonies coming in and stealing those resources. So that is an activity you see during the later part of the season. And in fact, when you're working bees, as you get into the later part of the season, August, September, and move into winter, those times of the year, oftentimes you'll notice a little bit of a shift in the attitudes of your bees. So the temperament of the bees will actually change a little bit, and they'll become a little more defensive than they do in the middle of the season. So for example, you could be used to be going out and doing inspections on your colonies during July, during a big honey flow where there's lots of resources around, and you really don't notice them, getting agitated towards you. As you get further and further into the season, and we get towards the end of the season where robbing becomes an activity, those bees will become more defensive, and you will notice them becoming more defensive to you as well. So something to keep in mind. In addition, the priorities of the colony really shift from producing brood in just well, I shouldn't say the priority shifts in the sense that the brood that's being produced is different than brood that is being produced during the season. And that is because during this time of the season, August, September, and as we move into the winter, what's happening is the bees that are being produced are our winter bees. And those are the bees that are going to survive throughout the winter. So that 4 to 6 month period that we have where there's no activity as far as we can tell from the colony because they're clustered inside, those winter bees are what make that distance. So normally your bees are going to survive somewhere between 45 and 60 days for a normal summer bee. Winter bees, 4 to 6 months is how long they live. So they are physiologically, they're actually a different kind of bee. They have different functions as far as glands are concerned, and they allocate resources differently by actually storing them in their bodies. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so what are your responsibilities during this time of the year as we get ready to go into the late part of summer? Well, number one, you need to ensure that Varroa is under control. I know you hear me talk about it nonstop, and you're probably sick of even thinking about it. But the fact of the matter is that over the years that I've been teaching, I find one kind of thing that's consistent with individuals that take education seriously is most folks that struggle to get bees to survive the winter and then finally hit a moment where they realize how important the control of Varroa is to winter bee survival. Those individuals, once folks start taking Varroa management seriously, is generally when I see folks starting to get bees through the winter without high losses. It's as simple as that. Varroa is your number one priority when it comes to management. Another thing we're going to talk about is colony health, is kind of diseases that you might see this time of the year, some that might have persisted from spring and some that may be present currently because of certain factors in the colony. Also talk about what you should be doing with colonies as far as strength in this lecture. So what do you do with a weak colony during this time of the year? And how do you rectify any problems that you might have with colonies that don't have good strength? And then we'll also talk about making sure that there's plenty of stored resources in this lecture as well in your colony. So really what you're doing right now as far as getting bees ready and making sure all of these things are in check is that you're trying to give your bees the best conditions to produce winter bees. You want your winter bees as healthy as possible. And keep in mind, once those bees come on, those are the bees that are going to be with you for 6 months. So you need to make sure, 4 to 6 months in northern climates. And so you need to make sure that they are the healthiest bees they can possibly be, because unhealthy winter bees will not get you through the winter, plain and simple. So let's go through the process of all of this. All right, so the number one priority that you have as a beekeeper is Varroa control. This is the one thing that's going to help you get through the winter. And I have it on here as 99.9% of colonies in the United States have Varroa. The reason I put that there is because there's probably somebody on a remote island somewhere who doesn't have Varroa mite. But for most of us, this is always going to be an issue that we have to learn how to deal with. Management of this is really the key to success in the modern era for beekeepers. It's the successful management of Varroa mite. It has this ability, and I've talked about this in other lectures, to take on the smells of the things that it comes in contact with. So essentially, when it's in the hive on bees, the bees cannot tell it's there. It is essentially camouflage because it smells just like everything else that's in the colony. So that is one of the main reasons why this is such an issue, is that the bees just don't recognize it within the colony. So how can you fight something that you don't even realize is there? The big thing that has come out in the last few years about how Varroa mite affects honeybees is this feeding on the fat body. So for years, we thought that Varroa mites were essentially sucking the hemolymph, which is kind of like the blood of bees, and that's how it was transmitting viruses into the bee. Sam Ramsey, a few years back, actually did a study as part of his PhD, where he actually determined that, in fact, it is not the hemolymph that they are feeding on, but rather the fat body in the organism that it was feeding upon, which is an organ in the honeybee. And this organ really it is something that is very important. And I'm going to get into that in the next slide. But what I want you to understand is by feeding on this fat body, it's really affecting immature bees and adult nurse bees, because that's generally where we find Varroa mite. So when we do Varroa mite sampling, we always do a frame of mixed brood on there, because we want nurse bees on there, the young bees. Those are the bees that the mites are using to move around on in the colony. And then those immature bees are those bees that we see that are being reared in the brood. And so both of those are being affected by this. The other thing to keep in mind about Varroa mite is it vectors over 20 different viruses that we know about, many of which are fatal, like that literally cause such severe issues that it can cause fatality of an individual or fatality of an entire colony or an entire colony. So things to keep in mind: the vectoring of these diseases, or the passive vectoring of these diseases, is a big problem with Varroa mite, but it is not the only problem. That feeding on the fat body has its own really kind of ripple effects when it comes to this, and I'm going to talk about that. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So what is a fat body? So that's what I talked about in the previous slide, that the Varroa mite is feeding upon. Now, fat bodies, you can kind of think about this as it has a lot of different important roles. It's like a storage organ. it kind of functions as a center for metabolism. It really allows for the honeybee to kind of accumulate lipid reserves, carbohydrates, proteins, amino acids, all sorts of metabolites. So really, the way that you kind of think about this is that it really is an area where a lot of processes are happening. And one of the main processes that are important for us as we go into this winter phase is this idea of it being a storage center. So this idea that it's a storage center is really important because these winter bees are living for many, many, many months, and they need to have big storage reserves in their bodies in order to actually make it through winter. So big fat bees are what we're going for. And you can see that on this photo here, the photo on the left is a bee that has a compromised fat body, where storage has not been able, they have not been able to put on that storage of resources like lipids and carbohydrates and amino acids and proteins. And instead, that would be kind of your skinny bee, whereas the bee on the right has all these big, fat, kind of white areas where all of these things are being stored. That's a big, healthy winter bee right there. It has all this internal storage so that it can really be able to feed on those stores for long periods of time over the course of the winter and be able to really make it through. Now, the other thing that this is really important for is that there's a particular vitellogenin is the compound. It's a glycolipid protein, so it has sugar, lipids, and protein all in it. It's a very, very important thing in honeybees and in their ability to survive. It's a major component of protein when bees are coming out of winter. So this is how they actually produce protein in a non-protein environment, is that they have the ability to produce vitellogenin. Vitellogenin is also really used to support the immune system as well. It also is a compound that is associated with prolonged life in honeybees. So for example, the queen has a very high amount of vitellogenin in her, which is one of the things that allows her to live so long. So vitellogenin has this kind of role as the ability to produce the food that's necessary to rear bees, the ability to be long-lived, and the ability to support a healthy immune system. So it plays very important roles in the bee, and the fat body is a center where this is being produced. So really what you should be taking from this is that the viruses are one thing that Varroa mite's responsible for communicating to bees, but the compromised fat body and the associated cascading effects that has on the health of bees because of the impact of things like vitellogenin, that is really detrimental to honeybees. So your winter bees that have had a fat body that's been compromised, they just don't have the same capability to assimilate resources in their body to survive long winters as a healthy fat body bee does. And so that is one of the biggest reasons why Varroa is so important. We harp on it a lot, and I know a lot of folks get sick of it. They think that this is just, the bees will be able to figure it out on their own. It's not the case. It's much more complicated than just the bees being able to deal with a pest. The way the pest affects the organism at large, the honeybee organism, both the micro and macro organism, those two components, that superorganism and then the individual, both of those are dramatically affected by this. So that's why it is so important. So a healthy fat body really is a key to bee survival. So how do we get a healthy fat body? We got to ensure that Varroa is under control. And this is a season-long effort. You've been hearing me talk about this all year long. The Varroa is something you manage as a season-long effort. It's not something that you can just say in the end of September, oops, I forgot to do Varroa management. I'm going to throw a Varroa treatment in there. No, that's not going to work because you've already got your winter bees on, and if they have been compromised, their bodies are just not able to assimilate those resources like we talked about. And so really this is what you should be focused on. It's not too late. So we generally see the way that Varroa kind of ramps up is in the spring. It kind of starts out kind of slow. You'll see kind of a steady rise at a very slow pace. We hit July and you essentially start to see these numbers skyrocket as far as Varroa is concerned. And the reason for that is that's when a lot of your brood is being put on in very, very big amounts, is that kind of June, July area. And so that's when Varroa starts to explode, is because you have this exponential growth happening where, you have one Varroa mite come in, you have 2 or 3 come out. That over time, thousands of times as far as broods being raised, that's a lot of Varroa mites that are being reared in your colony. And so this is a season-long effort. How do we do this? Well, we've got many videos and a couple lectures on this. What you're going to do is you're going to do a mite check every 3 to 4 weeks. If you have not done one this season, please do one. I mean, please do one. And let me say this. If you're at this time of the season and you have not done any treatments, you have not done any checks, it is not going to hurt to put a treatment in this time of the year, because I guarantee if you're in any area where there's honeybees or someone else keeping bees, they have Varroa mite. And so this is the one time I would tell you that if you have not done anything, it's an opportunity to put something in there right now and at least get some control. I would not encourage prophylactic treatments of any sort of pesticides or insecticides or miticides, when I work as in integrated pest management. But this is one of those situations where you have the pest. You definitely do. And if you've done nothing about it, it is already growing exponentially. So that's just something I'll put out there for right now. But normally you should be doing regular checks, and then based on the results of those checks, you should be treating your hive. One thing I will say that we have seen over the years of Varroa mite sampling is a lot of folks undersample. That is the number one problem that we see with sampling, is that we say you need to get 300 bees, which is a half a cup of bees. And most of the time what we find is that because it is such an uncomfortable process of getting bees into a measuring cup, most of the time people undersample. And so you don't actually have a full half cup of bees. Make sure when you're doing this that you have a good round cup of bees in there. There's some space in there. And so having a little bit of extra is definitely better than not having enough, because getting the false security that you have low Varroa mite counts, or maybe you're just under the threshold, but your sample wasn't large enough, that can cause some issues. So the one thing to keep in mind is the threshold that we have been using is the 3% infectivity levels. That means that if you do a sample with 300 mites, either the powdered sugar roll or the alcohol wash, you're going to be, if you have 9 mites in that 300 bee sample, that's 3% infectivity. That is the threshold to treat. So please take this seriously. Now I'm going to give you a little bit of advice on what to do this time of the year for controls. So these are the products that are available on the market for controlling Varroa mite that have not shown any resistance being developed in them. There's a couple old products that have been out there over the years, Checkmite being one of those, that has shown some resistance. And so I'm not going to talk about the chemicals that are available that have resistance associated with them in mites. These are all decent products, and these are all products that you should consider when treating Varroa mites. However, and I come back to this time and time again, the label is the most important thing you should be reading when considering what treatments you should be using. A lot of folks will put stuff on during this time of the year that's just not appropriate for this time of the year. Why? I don't know. Maybe it was the one product they thought, or maybe they think they're going to do something different than the norm. Most of us that work in this industry, we have chemicals that we use and we rotate with, but there's certain ones that are appropriate during certain times of the season. So I'm going to quickly go through these compounds and kind of give you the highs and lows of why or why not you would use this at this point in time. So Apiguard is the first one. That's a thymol as the active ingredient in that. The one thing the label says for thymol or for Apiguard in this formulation is that you can't use it during a honey flow. And it's a 4 to 6 week treatment. So that's the rest of the season practically. So if you plan on, harvesting any honey later in the season, this is not an option. because you're not supposed to use it during the honey flow. Apic var, so that's a thymol, and it also has essential oils as an active ingredient. Again, another compound that's not to be used during the honey flow. It has a 28 to 32 day treatment, so a month-long treatment. So if you put that in now, beginning of August, you're looking at September before the treatment is complete. Now, again, honey flow is a big thing here, because if you have not harvested honey yet, or are planning on harvesting honey anytime soon, a treatment like this is not going to be able to be utilized unless you pull those honey supers off first. Another one is apivar. That's amatraz is the active ingredient. That is about a 6 week treatment. It's like I think the label's like 40 something days to like 55 days. You can use it at any temperature, and some of these are temperature dependent. The last couple, Apigard is supposed to be 60 to 105 degrees, whereas Apilifer is 64 to 95 degrees for treatment. This one really doesn't have any temperature that you can use it at, that it doesn't work at. You can't have honey supers on. Also, the caveat about this one is that you can't have honey supers on for 14 days after the treatment is removed. So, for example, you have say if we go on the low end with a 40-day treatment, and then you have 14 more days after that, you have 54 days before you're going to be able to put on a honey super again. So, essentially, this would be the end of the season for you. Pulling honey off now and putting this treatment in to get that full treatment effect. Now, the next two I'm going to talk about, Formic Pro and or Mite Away Quick Strips are the two formulations for formic acid, and HopGuard 3 are really the ones you should be looking at during this time of the season as potential treatments. Personally, I like Formic Pro. I use Formic Pro during the season, one, because honey supers are okay when this is on. It has a temperature range of 50 to 85 degrees. Some of the areas of the country can get too hot for this treatment during the summer. We don't in the Upper Peninsula. Oftentimes, we'll get little windows of really warm weather, but generally this works fine just about any time while you're up in the UP, and a lot of parts of Michigan. As long as you're not getting those really, really hot summer days for consistent periods of time, this will work as a good treatment. The nice thing about formic acid is essentially between Mite Away Quick Strips and Formic Pro, you're looking at like a 14 to 20 day treatment, depending on what option you determine you want to use with these formulations. It's a very quick treatment. It works very effectively, and you can have honey supers on. So from the ones we've talked about so far, just from what the label says, this would be one of the most reasonable choices. It's a short treatment. You can get it on and get it off very quickly, and it's very effective, which may even leave you time to do a second treatment if you needed to in September. In addition, you can use it when honey supers are on, and a lot of us are still in the middle of the honey flow right now, and that's important to recognize. HopGuard 3, the active ingredients are beta acids from hops. This is a 14-day treatment. It also can be used during the honey flow. So another treatment that's quick, it's easy, and it can be used with the honey flow on. The next one is oxalic acid, and this can be done as a vaporization or dribble method. It does not penetrate brood cappings, and that is one of the main things to keep in mind with this treatment. I know a lot of folks that have been talking about this, doing 3 treatments at 7 days apart during the season with oxalic acid. And that is just not an appropriate use of that chemical. It doesn't penetrate the brood cappings. It even says on the label that you're not supposed to use it when brood is on. So by doing that, you're violating the laws that are the label, which is regulated by law. The other thing is this is not supposed to be used when honey supers are on. And so the fact that you're utilizing this during the time when honey is on is also a big no-no. And so this is something to keep in mind. Now, also keep in mind, these chemical treatments are not easy on bees and can be pretty tough on the bees sometimes. And so, three treatments, 21 days apart, that's a lot of chemical activity within that colony to be putting in there. Oxalic acid works good in 2 times of the year, in the spring before brood comes on and in the fall after brood comes off. That's when you should be using oxalic acid, not in the middle of the season. So when we go through all of these different compounds, what do we find? We find that really Formic Pro, Mite Away Quick Strips, and HopGuard are the compounds, the chemicals we should be looking at during this time of the season. Like I said, many of us are still in the middle of honey flows. If you want to continue to take advantage of those honey flows, these chemicals are going to allow you to do that. And they're quick chemicals to use in the end of the season, so you don't have these long application periods that are going to take you through the end of the season. But rather, you can get a quick treatment in, have knockdown really heavily, and then check your mites again. And again, you could do another treatment, a follow-up treatment, and still have time in September to do that, even followed up by an oxalic acid treatment in October. So by utilizing these chemistries that have shorter application times, you are giving yourself more time to continue to manage this pest rather than just giving it one shot with one chemical. So that's something really important to consider during this time of the year. All right, so as far as our Varroa portion of this lecture, in summary, if you don't manage your mites, your bees will not survive the winter. Every once in a while, I get somebody who tells me, oh yeah, I did nothing for them and the bees survived. It does happen. But at large, your bees are not going to survive if you don't manage Varroa, plain and simple. And I hope that I illustrated clearly why that's so important, especially when we talk about fat bodies and viral load. The fact that we have all these viruses being transmitted and the fact that we have a compromised fat body, which is inhibiting many, many important functions within the bee, including resource allocation within the body of the bee and resource storage and allocation, and also immune response. So, so two really important things right there that this is affecting. All right, colony health is also a really important thing to have under control this time of the year. The big thing you want to be asking yourself is your colony queen right now? A lot of times we get to this time in the year, and generally I start getting in kind of the late part of July a lot of phone calls about queens and the fact that my colony is not queen right. There's a lot of different reasons why your colony may not appear queen right, but the big thing is at this point in the season you need to ensure that you are queen right. If you are not queen right for one reason or another, you can get a mated queen. That's probably the best way to solve that situation, whether whatever the situation may be. Maybe you accidentally pinched a queen when you were doing an inspection and you need her replaced. You need to get a mated queen this time of the season. Raising a queen right now is really not a great strategy. And the reason is because you literally have 4 weeks from the start to finish of that process to where she's actually, 4 to 5 weeks even, where she's actually starting to lay again. And so by doing that right now in August, you're putting yourself to where your colony is not actually going to be queen right until September. And so you don't want to wait that long. You want to give them enough opportunity to raise a big, healthy amount of winter bees. So raising a queen this time of the year is really not an option here. You need to get a mated queen if you need a queen. Really, the big thing to also keep in mind here, as far as this is concerned, is that if you do have a colony that has, say, gone queenless and you have a laying worker, and I talked about this in another lecture and in some of our workshop videos, that if you have a laying worker situation, there is no option of adding a queen to fix that. You just need to combine it with a strong hive. So that is also part of these evaluations, is determining if you have a colony that's actually going to make it. And if you have a laying worker situation and this time of the year, and you are not queen right because of that, that is a situation where you have one option: combine it with another colony that is queen right. In addition, you also want to cull those weak colonies. If you have colonies that have been dinky all year and just have not been able to get their stuff together, this is the time where you can combine them with strong colonies and really be able to ensure that those bees don't just go to waste in that colony, dwindling away over the course of the rest of the summer, but rather join them with a stronger colony. So you're not too late to rectify some of these issues right now. But if you wait too long, if we get into September and you start finding these things out, then you're running up against some issues. So make sure that this is a good time of the year to take stock in what you got as far as health is concerned. All right, another aspect of colony health is disease. And during this time of the year, I don't get a ton of calls about disease. I say that. I had a call last week about European foul brood. But most of the time, this is not, okay, I should back up. I don't get as many calls during this time of the year. It doesn't mean that there's not disease out there, but I'm going to cover a couple of the common ones that I do run across and get questions about this year, or this time of the year. The big ones are, well, number one, European foul brood. So normally this is a spring disease. It's a bacterial disease that usually is associated with stress during kind of resource-strapped times of the beginning of the season where the colony is building, but maybe the resources or access to the resources is just not as readily available as they need it during that time. So it could stress upon the colony. So you can see I say here it's associated with sporadic nectar. It also is a situation where there's just not a lot of nurse bees in the colony. So again, a stress situation. It is highly contagious as a bacterial disease that's passed in the food, and the bees die in the larval stage. So those are some of the key indicators, but this sometimes with colonies that are not being checked regularly, this can persist into the summer if not checked early in the season, as far as rectified during the early part of the season. Usually, most colonies will get out of this. If you have a colony that's suffering from this in the spring, generally you can feed your way out of it. So one of the strategies, and I think I come at it here in another lecture or in another slide. Yeah, I'll come at it in another slide. But one of the techniques is essentially feeding them heavy with sugar water and pulling the pollen that's in the colonies out to get that bacteria out of the colony. Because again, it is passed in the food. So what are some of the symptoms of European foul brood if you suspect that you have this this time of the year? Again, it tends to be a spring disease, but just in case. The symptoms that you're going to see are uncapped brood cells. So brood cells that have larva that's kind of twisted and discolored that is sunken down to the bottom of the cell. And you can see in these pictures here, and we've talked about this many, many times when we talk about the health and how we determine if something does not look right in a brood chamber. The larva that you see, kind of this bottom left larva that you see here, this bright white C-shaped larva, that's what larvae should look like. What you're seeing in these other cells, this discoloration and this kind of melting and twisting to the bottom of the cell, that is unhealthy larva. And that is what we see with European foul brood, is we tend to see this discoloration. That's because of the actual bacteria being passed in food. It discolors the body. And this twisting, kind of rotting, or kind of slumping down to the bottom of the cell. A lot of times the larva can also seem kind of dried out. So you can actually kind of see this kind of, well, I don't want to call it, it looks dry. Let's just say that. This also can appear as spotty brood because you have this dead larva that's in these cells and they're not able to be refilled. The other thing that you can sometimes see is an odor associated, well, you can sometimes smell, is an odor associated with this. There are several different strains of this bacteria. Melococcus platoneus is the actual species, but there's many subspecies of this particular bacteria. Some of them are associated with odors and some of them are not. So odor is not always a key diagnostic, but sometimes there is kind of a rotten cheese odor associated with this particular bacteria. All right, so what do we do if we have European foul brood? Well, there's a couple different things that you can do. One, you can do a shook swarm technique. Say that 10 times fast. That is basically a technique where you're basically taking them off of the equipment that they're on and putting them on new equipment. Literally shaking all the bees off that equipment because, again, the bacteria is in the food, so you're just getting rid of those resources. You can remove pollen frames. I talked about that, removing the pollen frames and then feeding heavy with both sugar water and pollen substitute. Again, the bacteria is in the pollen and in the food, so that is where it's located. So by removing that, you can remove a big bulk of that bacteria, and by supplementally feeding it, oftentimes this will clear out. And that's a technique that I use regularly in the early part of the season if I ever see anything with European foul brood, and it works very good. You can use terramycin for this, but it does require a veterinarian feed directive or a prescription to utilize. That's an antibiotic. It is available, and it is you can use it for that. Generally, the feeding and the removing pollen is a pretty good technique, and works pretty quickly as far as rectifying those issues. Just a note at the bottom here, I do get calls about American foul brood from time to time. I just want you to note that European foul brood is really what we have here in prevalence in Michigan. American foul brood is much more rare here. I always try to think about this. I think I've only seen real American foul brood, maybe twice in my career over the last 13 years. So that it used to be, it almost brought the American honeybee industry to its knees at one point. We thought it was going to totally collapse the industry at one point. but it's not as big of a problem nowadays. So it's very rare that you're going to find American foul brood. So I just wanted to note that in here because a lot of folks do worry about it. I mean, when you listen to lectures, even my pest and disease lecture, it's something that we talk about, but it is rare. Okay, the other thing that I see during this time of the year that's much more prevalent than European foul brood, and probably the most common thing that I see this time of the year with folks that I'm working with, is parasitic mite syndrome. So the thing about parasitic mite syndrome is a lot of folks mistake it as foul brood because it does kind of look like it in a lot of respects. As far as, you know, if you were just looking at this picture here and you see these slumped down larvae to the bottoms of the cells, if you didn't know any better, that could be mistaken as European foul brood. It's not European foul brood in this case. This is what we call parasitic mite syndrome. The one thing about parasitic mite syndrome that I can tell you is that we actually don't know what the causal agent of it is. We don't know what is causing this, but what we do know is it is always associated with Varroa mites. So it is something that's happening between the interaction of bees and Varroa mites that's being passed on that's causing this. We just haven't nailed it down and don't know what the actual causal agent is. Okay, so what are the symptoms of parasitic mite syndrome? Like I said, sometimes this can be easily mistaken for European foul brood. But what we did see in that European foul brood picture that you don't really see here is the twisting motion. So you can see that these slump down to the bottom, but there is not this, at least from my perspective, there's not this twist that comes into this. So what you generally see, you'll see a rapid decline in population. You'll see supersedure oftentimes. They're trying to rectify this because they think it's a queen issue. You'll see a lack of eggs and larvae. You'll have a lack of adult population. One thing you will see is chewed down larvae. That's a very diagnostic tool that we use for this particular condition, is that you will see larvae that essentially has been chewed down from the top. And I'll show you a picture of that here in the next slide. The other one that you can see is increased aggression. The bees just become more agitated. And you will oftentimes, if you are seeing Varroa mite in your colony, walking around on frames, walking around on adult bees, that's a big problem. If you've got that many mites where you're seeing them with the naked eye just walking around the colony, oftentimes that is a key diagnostic sign that you are going to be dealing with or going to be dealing with the symptoms associated with parasitic mite syndrome. So something to keep in mind. This picture right here, you can see this is a cell right here that has been chewed down. So you're actually looking at kind of half of a bee right there. And then it looks like this is a Varroa mite right here at the bottom. So really, that is, again, one of the signs that we see associated with parasitic mite syndrome. What do you have as far as options for parasitic mite syndrome? Well, you need to get those mites under control. That's your option. So that is the one thing that you can do to rectify this, is to start managing mites. Again, it is such an important component about modern day beekeeping. I know it's not something we want to deal with is pest management all the time, but that's the reality of the situation we're in. And so we need to take that seriously as beekeepers. Colony, you want to make sure your colony is strong. You want to make sure that at this time of the year that you have lots of bees and lots of brood of all ages. The thing you need to keep in mind is that the bees that you are dealing with now in your colony are the bees that are going to raise those winter bees to get you through the winter. And so you want them to be healthy. You want them to be strong because you want to put on lots of strong, healthy, fat winter bees. The thing that keep in mind is that even though you want those big colonies, those are the colonies that are at highest risk for Varroa because there's so much brood hatching all the time. So because you have so much brood, just statistically, there's going to be more Varroa. And so you have to take this more seriously with these big colonies. Oftentimes, it is the big colonies that will die first from Varroa going into the winter that have been untreated because the mite populations are just so high in these big colonies. And then I get calls the following year and say, Adam, I had this huge, strong colony that went into the winter and it died on me. And I don't know why. It's just a big dead box of bees. And the first thing I'll ask is, okay, well, what was your Varroa management plan for last year? We didn't manage Varroa. We didn't ever see it. And hands down, that's why your colony did not survive. It's not that you don't have Varroa. It's just that you don't see it typically because of where it is occurring in the hive, which is typically underneath the abdominal segments of the nurse bees and in the immature brood. All right, if you have a weak colony, that you have just not been able to just hasn't been able to get it together all season. What is your option? Well, it's to combine it with a strong colony. It's an easy option. You're not losing anything. Take your losses in the fall instead of losing colonies through the winter. You can build up strong colonies and get them through the fall, and then split them again in the spring. A normal split you saw on the video, that I did this year, I got 8 splits from an overwintered colony, and that's, you can get multiple splits off of a colony by bringing them together, 2 colonies together, and getting them through the winter. You will essentially come out on top the other side of the season, because you'll probably get more than 1 split out of that colony as long as you get it through winter. It's really important to consider that and not try to limp through dinky colonies. It is tough to get a small colony through the winter. They don't thermoregulate as well as large colonies. So it is important to realize that your decisions to keep a colony small and try and limp it through the season, or combine it with another colony to make a strong colony, those decisions are going to have long-term impacts on your bee's survivability. I have on here a weak colony has no chance of making it through winter. It's not necessarily true. They do make it through winter sometimes. Like I said, there's always exceptions to the rule, but general rule of thumb, a small colony is not going to make it through the winter. Generally, they just don't have the resources and haven't put on the fat bees that you need to get through the winter. All right, plenty of stored resources. This is really important. Honey being stored in the colony is huge. Make sure you leave your bees with enough honey, because the honey is essentially the energy that, or the calories that they're burning in order to thermoregulate. So it's a very important substance to them. The thing you don't want to do is take all the honey for you and leave nothing for the bees. Now, I'm going to show you kind of an evaluation method that I use to determine how much honey I have on a colony that's stored honey that's bringing them into winter. But what I want to underscore first is that for Michigan winters, and this varies across the country, so if you're in other places, this may not apply to you. When I lived in California, in San Luis Obispo area, I mean, really, floral resources ended in maybe December and started right back up in late January. So there's not really much time where where resources aren't available. So a very different situation out there. For those of us in northern climates, though, you got to have enough honey to get through. I like to see somewhere, north of 100 pounds of honey on each one of my hives to make sure I make it through winter. But that's something you need to consider. You can see in this diagram here, and I think I've shown this to you. Well, I may have not shown this to you yet. I know it's in the overwintering lecture. But this is essentially a diagram of the cluster that we talk about when we're talking about winter clustering. You can see that there's the brood nest. This is where the queen's going to be. In the middle here, there's this core around that, and then this dense mantle layer, which is kind of like an insulative layer. It's essentially where bees are kind of interconnected together to create this dense insulative layer. The older bees that are on the outside of this. Really kind of an incredible phenomenon. But what I want to illustrate in this is that you can see just by the temperatures on here, and if you don't have your fancy Celsius converter with you, I have converted it for you. Essentially, the middle of this area is about 90 degrees. Once you get out into this loose core area, the dense mantle layer outside of that loose core area, which is 90 degrees, you're looking at about 75 degrees. As you get out into that next layer, the mantle layer, your mantle layer, you're looking at 75 degrees. And then once you get out of that, it's just radiant heat that's outside of that. So they're not actually heating the inside of the hive. They're maintaining, thermoregulating the cluster. And so that's important to recognize, that they're not actually heating the inside of the hive. And that's a misconception that's around a lot that we see with overwintering. So how do you calculate your hive weights? So the way that you do this, and this is just a down and dirty way to do this. There's definitely inaccuracies in this. There's a lot of room for I don't want to say room for error, but it's just not an exact measurement, but it gets you close, and at least gives you an idea of how much excess honey you have. So how do you calculate the weights? Well, what I use is an analog bathroom scale from Wally World that essentially I put under the front of the hive. So you can see I start with the front of the hive. I put my scale under there, and then I set it down on the scale. Take that number, and put it in my head, and then I go to the back of the colony and I do the same thing. I put it on the scale, weigh it, and then add those two numbers together, and that gives me a rough estimate of what my total hive weight is. Now, in order to actually determine how much honey you have in there, you've got to do some math. And so here is a general table. These weights will change depending on manufacturer of equipment. This is all Man Lake equipment that this has been measured with. So if you're using another manufacturer, it may be a pound or two different depending on the piece of equipment you're using. But you can, and this is something you can do with yourself too. You can take that bathroom scale and take your equipment and weigh it, so you know exactly what your equipment weighs. So the things you're going to weigh and the things you're going to consider are, what are the weight of my hive bodies and my frames? What are the weight of my bottom board, my telescoping cover, my inner cover, or if you're using a migratory cover, what is that weight? You take those weights together and then you subtract them from the total. Generally, it's going to be, if you have like a box that's 4 or 5, if you have a medium setup or two deeps and two mediums, but if you had 5 mediums, say, or that other combination of deeps and mediums, you're going to be somewhere around 75 pounds or 80 pounds as far as raw equipment is concerned. So that's basically how you would subtract that. And it gets you get a kind of a rough idea of what you need. All right, so you also, if you do realize that you have colonies that are kind of struggling for resources or not putting on enough weight, this is also the time of the year where you can start feeding them heavily. And 2-to-1 sugar water is what typically is talked about during this time of the year. And this does not have to be an exact measurement, but getting them sugar that they can store is really important. The other thing you can keep in mind is if you have a huge hive like this one here that's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 boxes deep. If you've got a hive like that that's got just a ton of excess honey on it, you can harvest that honey, obviously, but you can also support a colony that doesn't have enough honey on it to get through winter with that box of honey as well. So those are alternatives as well. So you can feed them or you can support them with resources from another colony. This is why we always say you should have multiple colonies. You know, one colony, if you just have one beehive, you oftentimes get in situations where you need support from another hive. And if you don't have that other hive to pull support from, that can be a problem. All right, to summarize this lecture, how are you going to get prepared for winter this time of the season? 1, you're going to ensure Varroa is under control. That's the #1 priority that you need to take into consideration. 2, you're going to make sure that your colonies are disease-free. You know, you want to make sure that there's no issues with queen rite. You want to make sure that there's no issues with any disease at this time of the season. Again, this is a critical time of the season. We're getting in a time when your winter bees are getting put on, the most important bees that you have to get you through winter. And they are the only bees that are going to get you through winter. So make sure that you are giving them the best conditions to be raised. The other thing is to ensure that your colonies are strong. You're not trying to just limp through some dinky colonies to say I have 4 colonies instead of 3. Again, the apiary is a dynamic place where we shouldn't get hung up on numbers because things fluctuate over the course of the season up and down as far as number of hives that we're concerned with and keeping. We're responding to the needs of the bees, not our desires to have a certain number of colonies. The other thing is to make sure you have plenty of stored food. So stored honey on there is a really important thing to make sure you've got. That is going to be what they are going to be using to get through the winter as far as a resource to produce energy, to produce heat. So that is really important. Again, this is really right now what we're talking about this next month and 2 is this is your last chance to get this right before we hit winter bee production. This is the time of the year to take all of this really, really seriously, because if you don't, your winter bees are not going to be fat, healthy bees to get you through winter. They're going to be skinny, resource depleted because they haven't been able to allocate any of those resources into their bodies. They're just going to struggle. They're just not going to be able to make it. You want fat, healthy bees this time of the year. Again, because those are your winter bees. All right, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'll look forward to talking to you on the next one.